Montana Territory, 1875. The wind swept across the golden prairie grass like invisible fingers combing through hair, carrying with it the scent of sage and promise. Emerson Knight sat tall in his saddle, scanning the rolling hills that stretched toward the distant Bitterroot Mountains. At 25, he'd already seen more of life's harshness than most men twice his age. The war had taken his father and brother, leaving him alone to build something from nothing in this untamed land. His Rocking K ranch wasn't much, a modest cabin, small barn, and 100 acres that tested his resolve with each passing season. But it was his, earned through sweat and stubborn determination. The morning sun glinted off his sandy brown hair as he adjusted his hat, the shadow playing across features too handsome for a man who spent most days in solitude. A man who ties himself to others is just asking for heartache, he muttered to his horse, a philosophy forged in loss. Emerson believed the frontier demanded self-reliance above all. Partnerships meant vulnerability, and vulnerability got you killed out here where nature and man showed little mercy. He'd learned that lesson watching his mother wither away after his father's death, her grief a slow poison he vowed never to risk. What Emerson wanted was simple, to make the Rocking K prosperous enough to prove he hadn't failed his family's memory. What he told himself he didn't need was the complication of friendship, or worse yet, love. The frontier was no place for such luxuries. Yet sometimes, in the quiet evenings when the cabin's emptiness seemed to expand until it threatened to swallow him whole, a traitorous voice whispered that perhaps survival alone wasn't enough. 2 weeks of spring rain had turned the trail into a muddy obstacle course, making Emerson's monthly journey into Riverspend more arduous than usual. The settlement could hardly be called a proper town yet. A general store, saloon, smithy, and a handful of other establishments stretched along a single dusty street, but it served as the lifeblood for the scattered ranches and homesteads in the valley. He tied his horse outside Caldwell's general store, the wooden porch creaking beneath his boots. The bell above the door announced his entrance with a cheerful jingle that contrasted with his grave expression. Emerson was beginning to think you'd washed away in that deluge, Samuel Caldwell called from behind the counter, his gray beard speckled with flour. Takes more than rain to keep me from supplies, Emerson replied, removing his hat. Need the usual plus extra coffee if you've got it. Certainly do, had a delivery just yesterday, Samuel said, then lowered his voice. Might want to add something special to your order. Got a young lady arrived on yesterday's stage. Says she's looking for work. Emerson's jaw tightened, not looking for help, Sam. The older man shrugged. Suit yourself, but good help's rare out here. She's over at Widow Miller's boarding house if you change your mind. Emerson gave a non-committal grunt and began listing his supplies, determined to ignore the suggestion. He didn't need complications, and women were nothing if not complicated. He might have succeeded in forgetting the matter entirely if not for what happened next. The store's door swung open, bringing with it a gust of wind and a young woman who seemed to draw all the air from the room. She stood just over 5 feet tall, her deep blue dress simple but well kept, cinched at a narrow waist. At 22, her face held both youth's softness and a certain weathered determination in her eyes. Thick chestnut hair was pinned neatly beneath a modest bonnet, though errant curls had escaped to frame her face. What struck Emerson most wasn't her evident beauty, but the resolve in her posture, shoulders squared against whatever hardships had brought her to this remote outpost. Mr. Caldwell, she nodded politely, her voice carrying the refined notes of Eastern education. I was hoping you might have those items we discussed. Miss Harrington, of course, Samuel beamed, gesturing toward Emerson. May I introduce Emerson Knight, owns the Rocking K about 10 miles east. Emerson, this is Miss Felicity Harrington, just arrived from Boston. Emerson reluctantly tipped his hat. Miss Harrington. She met his gaze directly, something uncommon among the women he'd encountered. Mr. Knight. Miss Harrington's looking for a position, Samuel continued, ignoring Emerson's warning glance. Teacher by training, but capable of most anything, I'd wager. I'm quite adaptable, she added, a flicker of desperation beneath her composed exterior. I can cook, clean, mend, keep accounts. I'm not afraid of hard work. I'm sure you'll find something suitable in town, Emerson replied, more curtly than he'd intended. Something flashed in her eyes, pride, perhaps, or determination. Yes, I'm certain I will. Good day, gentlemen. After she'd left, Samuel shook his head. That was unkind, even for you, son. I don't need help, Emerson insisted, but the words rang hollow even to his ears. The truth was, he desperately needed help. Spring calving had nearly broken him with endless sleepless nights, and the work only multiplied as summer approached. But hiring anyone meant letting them into his world, his space, his carefully constructed solitude. "She's running from something," Samuel said quietly. "Arrived with nothing but one trunk and refused to discuss family. Widow Miller says she cries at night when she thinks no one hears." Emerson stiffened, unwelcome empathy stirring. "Not my concern." "Course not," Samuel agreed too easily. "Just thought you should know she'll likely move on if nothing turns up. Stage heads west next week." The thought shouldn't have bothered Emerson, but it did. By the time he'd finished his errands, dark clouds were gathering again. The prospect of a muddy 10-mile ride in pouring rain did nothing to improve his mood. He was securing his supplies when he spotted her again, standing beneath the overhang of the boarding house, staring at the threatening sky. Something, perhaps the way rain started pattering on the boardwalk, or how she clutched a worn book to her chest like a shield, made him hesitate. Before he could question his judgment, he found himself crossing the street. "Miss Harrington," he called, stopping a respectful distance away. "I might have spoken hastily earlier." She regarded him warily. "Oh. I could use some help through the summer at least." The words felt foreign in his mouth. "Cooking mainly, some housekeeping, it's not fancy work." "Is it paid work, Mr. Knight?" "Room and board plus $15 monthly." It was more than fair, and they both knew it. She straightened, considering him with an evaluating gaze that made him feel strangely transparent. "When would I start?" "Today, if you're able, weather's turning." "I'll need a few minutes to gather my things," she said after a moment's hesitation. An hour later they were riding through increasingly heavy rain, Felicity perched uncomfortably on a borrowed mare, her single trunk strapped behind Emerson's saddle. They traveled mostly in silence, the deluge making conversation impossible. By the time they reached the ranch, both were soaked to the skin despite their rain gear. Emerson helped her down, noticing how she winced. Not much of a rider. "Not recently," she admitted, attempting to maintain dignity despite her bedraggled appearance. He led her to the cabin, suddenly seeing it through a stranger's eyes, the sparse furnishings, the functional but cheerless interior. A single room with a stone fireplace, kitchen area, and his sleeping space sectioned off by a simple curtain. A narrow staircase led to a small loft. "It's not much," he said unnecessarily. "It's shelter," she replied, and something in her voice suggested she understood the value of that simple fact all too well. Emerson built up the fire while Felicity stood dripping on the plank floor, uncertain. "The loft will be yours," he said, gesturing to the stairs. "I'll bring your trunk up once it's a bit drier." "There's a screen up there for privacy." He paused awkwardly. "You can change into something dry. I need to check the livestock." When he returned, she'd changed into a simpler dress and had somehow transformed the barren table into a proper dining space, complete with a steaming pot of coffee and reheated beans from his morning cookfire. "I hope you don't mind," she said, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. "I thought you might appreciate something warm after being out in this weather." Emerson stared, momentarily speechless. It had been years since anyone had thought of his comfort. That night, as rain drummed against the roof, Emerson lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving quietly in the loft above. What had possessed him to bring a stranger, a woman no less, into his home? The frontier was unforgiving to those who made impulsive decisions. Yet something about her circumstances nagged at him, an echo of his own past perhaps. Morning brought clear skies and the unfamiliar aroma of fresh biscuits. Emerson found Felicity already dressed and working in the kitchen area, her hair neatly braided and pinned. "I hope I haven't overstepped," she said, noticing his surprise. "I found flour and lard in the pantry." "No, it's fine," he cleared his throat. "Been a while since I had proper biscuits." Over breakfast, he outlined her duties: cooking, cleaning, mending, tending the kitchen garden, and explained his daily routines. She listened attentively, asking practical questions that revealed she wasn't as unprepared for ranch life as he'd initially assumed. "I should warn you," he said finally, "this isn't Boston. Nearest neighbors are 3 miles away, towns further." "It gets lonely." Something closed behind her eyes. "I prefer solitude to certain kinds of company, Mr. Knight." The statement hung between them, laden with unspoken history. Emerson recognized the boundary she'd drawn and respected it. Whatever she was running from, she wasn't ready to share it. "Emerson," he said finally, "if we're sharing quarters, Mr. Knight seems overly formal." Then I'm Felicity, she replied, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. The first week established their routine. Emerson rose before dawn, handled morning chores, then worked the ranch until dusk. Felicity transformed the cabin's interior, unearthing long-forgotten items from cupboards and creating surprising comforts from meager resources. She never complained about the isolation or the primitive conditions, instead attacking each task with quiet efficiency. By the second week, Emerson found himself hurrying through evening chores to return to the cabin's warm light. For the first time since his family's deaths, the place felt like more than mere shelter. They began sharing supper conversations, careful at first, then gradually more natural. He learned she'd been teaching at a girls' school in Boston. She discovered he'd fought for the Union despite his Kentucky roots. What neither discussed were the shadows that sometimes darkened their expressions, or why she'd traveled alone to such a remote territory, or what made him start violently from sleep some nights, shouting names of men long dead. The third week brought the first real test of their arrangement. Emerson returned from checking fence lines to find Felicity struggling with the ancient pump at the well, her dress sodden and face flushed with exertion. "Darn thing's stuck again," he said, dismounting quickly to help. "Should have warned you. It needs a certain touch." "I nearly had it," she insisted, stepping back to allow him access but watching intently as he manipulated the handle with practiced movements. "There's a trick to it," he explained, demonstrating. "Got to prime it just right or it fights you all the way." To his surprise, she immediately stepped forward. "Show me again, I want to learn." The request was simple but struck Emerson forcefully. Most women would have been content to leave such tasks to him, but Felicity wanted to master it herself. He guided her hands on the pump, becoming acutely aware of their proximity, the scent of lavender soap, the damp curls escaping her usually immaculate braid, the determined set of her jaw. "Like this?" she asked, successfully drawing water. "Perfect," he replied, his voice unexpectedly rough. That evening he found himself telling her about his plans for the ranch, breeding better stock, expanding toward the eastern ridge, perhaps growing wheat in the lower fields, plans he'd never voiced aloud before. She listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that sometimes challenged his thinking. "You've put considerable thought into this," she observed. "It's all I have," he admitted. "Making this place work." "Is that enough?" The question was soft but direct. Emerson stared into the fire. "Has to be." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "We all need something to build toward." "What are you building toward, Felicity?" he asked, venturing into territory they'd tacitly avoided. Her hand stilled on the shirt she was mending. "Safety for now," she said finally. "Beyond that, I'm not certain anymore." The honest vulnerability in her answer touched something in Emerson that had been dormant for years. That night, lying in bed, he recognized the danger in their growing connection. Felicity Harrington was temporary, seeking work until something better came along. Getting attached would only end in the familiar pain of loss. He resolved to maintain proper distance going forward. His resolution proved difficult to keep. As May turned to June, Felicity became indispensable not just for her work but for her presence. She learned to ride properly, accompanying him on shorter trips around the property. She meticulously organized his chaotic financial records, revealing that his operation was closer to profitability than he'd realized. Most disarmingly, she brought laughter back into a house that had known only grim silence for too long. One evening, returning from town with supplies, Emerson heard something so unexpected he initially thought he'd imagined it, piano music drifting from the cabin. He entered to find Felicity seated at his mother's old piano, which had stood unused in the corner since her death. The instrument was badly out of tune, but Felicity's skilled fingers coaxed a recognizable melody from the yellowed keys. She stopped abruptly when she noticed him. "I hope you don't mind. I used to play, and when I was dusting." "My mother played that same song," he said quietly. "I can stop." "No," he set down his packages. "Please continue." As she resumed playing, something tight in Emerson's chest began to loosen. Memories of his mother at that same piano, his father's deep laugh, his brother's off-key singing, memories he'd locked away because they hurt too much filtered back, but now tinged with warmth rather than just pain. Later that night, after Felicity had retired to the loft, Emerson retrieved a small wooden box from beneath a floorboard under his bed. Inside lay his family's few treasures, his father's pocket watch, his mother's cameo brooch, letters, and documents including the deed to the ranch. He rarely looked at these remnants of his past, but tonight something compelled him to revisit these connections to who he had been before loss hardened him. Among the papers was his father's journal, the last entries detailing his hopes for the ranch and his sons. The familiar handwriting blurred as Emerson read by lamplight, his father's voice almost audible across the years. A man needs more than land to make a life worth living. He needs people to share it with. The words haunted Emerson as he put away the box. His father had understood something he'd been denying, that his isolation wasn't strength but fear dressed as independence. The following day brought scorching heat that promised the summer's first thunderstorm. Emerson worked through midday moving cattle to higher pasture. Returning to find Felicity had converted the porch into a cool retreat with a pitcher of cold tea and slices of freshly baked bread. "You'll make yourself ill working in this heat," she chided, pouring him a glass. Her cheeks were flushed from the kitchen's warmth, tendrils of hair clinging to her neck. "Been working in worse for years," he replied, though he gratefully accepted the drink. "That doesn't make it wise." Her directness, once disconcerting, had become one of the qualities he most appreciated. They sat on the porch steps, watching heat lightning flash in the distant mountains. The approaching storm charged the air with anticipation, making ordinary conversation seem suddenly insufficient. "Why did you really come west, Felicity?" Emerson asked, the question escaping before he could reconsider. She was quiet so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, as if testing each word before releasing it. "I was engaged to be married in Boston." Henry Blackwell, from a prominent banking family, it seemed a good match, financially secure, socially acceptable. She twisted the glass in her hands, "But I discovered he wasn't the man he appeared to be. When I tried to break the engagement, he became threatening. Said he would ruin my reputation, ensure I never taught again." Anger flared in Emerson's chest. "Did he hurt you?" "Not physically, but his words, his control." "It was a different kind of violence." She met Emerson's gaze directly. "I left everything behind rather than become his possession. My family sided with him. They saw only the advantageous connection, not what lay beneath his polished manners." "So you ran west." "I chose freedom," she corrected gently, "even if it meant uncertainty." Understanding bloomed between them. Both had been shaped by loss and choice. Both valued independence yet hungered for connection. The first heavy raindrops began to fall, but neither moved to seek shelter. "You're braver than I am," Emerson said finally. "I've been hiding, not living." "We do what we must to survive," Felicity replied, her hand briefly touching his arm. "But perhaps surviving isn't enough anymore." The touch, simple as it was, sent warmth through Emerson that had nothing to do with the summer heat. Before he could respond, the skies opened in earnest, sending them laughing into the shelter of the cabin, the moment of revelation suspended between them. That night, the storm's fury matched the turmoil in Emerson's thoughts. Felicity had awakened feelings he'd believed long buried, not just desire, though that was certainly part of it, but deeper longings for companionship and shared purpose. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a different future than the solitary existence he'd accepted as inevitable. As June stretched into July, subtle changes altered the rhythm of ranch life. Emerson found reasons to spend more time at the cabin, repairs he'd long neglected, improvements to the kitchen garden, a new shelf for Felicity's growing collection of books ordered from the catalog. She in turn began accompanying him more frequently on his rides, revealing an unexpected affinity for the land that matched his own. They never spoke directly of what was growing between them, but it manifested in 100 small ways: lingering glances across the supper table, hands brushing while passing tools, conversations that stretched into the night. The boundaries Emerson had so carefully constructed were crumbling, and he found himself increasingly unwilling to rebuild them. The situation came to a head one evening when Samuel Caldwell arrived unexpectedly, bringing mail and news from town. While Felicity prepared coffee, Samuel pulled Emerson aside on the porch. "Thought you should know," he said quietly. "There's been inquiries about Miss Harrington. Man from back east sending telegrams to settlements throughout the territory." Emerson's jaw tightened. "What kind of inquiries?" "Looking for a young woman of her description. Says she's his fiancée, claims she's unwell and confused, needs returning to her family." "That's not true," Emerson said flatly. Samuel raised an eyebrow. "Figured as much, thought you'd want to warn her, though. If he's got money to send telegrams this far west, he's likely got means to do more." After Samuel departed, Emerson found Felicity washing dishes, humming softly. The domesticity of the scene struck him powerfully, how natural her presence had become, how empty the cabin would feel without her. The thought of someone threatening that newfound peace ignited a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. "Felicity," he began carefully, "Samuel brought some news you should know." He watched her face pale as he relayed the information, her hands gripping the dishcloth until her knuckles whitened. "He found me," she whispered. "I never thought he'd pursue this far." "You're safe here," Emerson assured her, fighting the urge to take her hands in his. "Am I?" Her eyes met his, filled with doubt. "What happens when he arrives in Riverspend?" "When he brings letters proving his claims, people will believe a wealthy Easterner over a woman alone." "You're not alone," Emerson said firmly. "You have me." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond their simple reassurance. "For how long?" she asked softly. "I'm your hired help, Emerson, when summer ends." "Stay," the word emerged before he could consider its implications. "Not as help, as whatever you wish to be." Color rose in her cheeks. "What are you saying?" Emerson struggled to articulate feelings long suppressed. "I'm saying this place hasn't felt like home in years, not until you came." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You don't know what you're offering." "I know exactly what I'm offering," he countered. "Partnership, a life built together." "And if he comes," the fear in her voice ignited something fierce in Emerson's chest. "Then he'll find you're no longer alone and unprotected." The moment stretched between them, fragile with possibility. Then Felicity stepped forward and placed her hand against his cheek, the simple gesture more intimate than any embrace. "I need time," she whispered, "to be certain this isn't just gratitude or fear making decisions for me." Emerson covered her hand with his own. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." That night, after Felicity had gone upstairs, Emerson returned to his father's journal, seeking guidance across the years. As he leafed through the familiar pages, a folded document he'd never noticed before slipped from between the later entries. Curious, he unfolded what appeared to be a land survey with accompanying legal text, dated 1865, just before his father left for war. As he read, Emerson's heartbeat quickened. The document detailed mineral rights to a section of the Eastern Ridge, rights his father had purchased separately from the main property deed. According to the survey, the ridge contained a substantial coal deposit, potentially valuable now that the railroad was pushing westward. Emerson sat back, stunned. If this was legitimate, it could transform the ranch's prospects entirely. The Eastern Ridge, the very land he'd been planning to expand toward, might hold the key to securing the Rocking K's future. It wasn't just land, it was legacy and security wrapped together. His first impulse was to share the discovery with Felicity, but he hesitated. She'd asked for time to consider his offer, to ensure her feelings weren't colored by circumstances. If he presented this potential windfall now, would it appear he was trying to influence her decision with promises of wealth? The thought troubled him. No, he decided, this information could wait. Whatever Felicity chose, it should be based on what existed between them, not potential fortune. He carefully returned the document to the journal and replaced the box beneath the floorboard. The next morning brought clear skies and the familiar rhythm of ranch work, but an undercurrent of tension hummed beneath ordinary interactions. Emerson's declaration had changed something fundamental between them, creating a new awareness that manifested in averted gazes and careful distance. By afternoon, the strain became unbearable. Emerson saddled his horse, needing physical activity to clear his thoughts. "I'm riding the north fence line," he told Felicity. "Won't be back till evening." She nodded, her expression unreadable. "Be careful." The hours of solitary work did little to settle Emerson's thoughts. Had he spoken too soon, pushed too hard? The idea of losing Felicity now that he'd acknowledged his feelings was more painful than he'd anticipated. Yet demanding an immediate answer would only pressure her unfairly. The sun was setting when he finally turned homeward, the golden light casting long shadows across the prairie. As the cabin came into view, something about the scene immediately struck him as wrong. Felicity's usual lamp wasn't lit in the window, and the chimney showed no smoke despite the cooling evening. Alarm rising, Emerson urged his horse faster. As he approached, he spotted the broken door hanging from its hinges and a horse he didn't recognize tied at the post. He dismounted quickly, drawing the revolver he carried for protection against predators. Moving silently to the damaged doorway, he heard voices inside, Felicity's, tight with fear, and a man's, cultured but laced with menace. "Your behavior has been most disappointing, Felicity," the male voice said coldly. "Causing such embarrassment to your family, to me, but I'm willing to be magnanimous. Return with me now and we'll put this unfortunate episode behind us." I'm not returning anywhere with you, Henry. Felicity's voice trembled but remained resolute. Our engagement is over. It was a mistake from the beginning. A mistake, the man's tone hardened. The mistake was thinking you had any choice in the matter. I've invested too much in this arrangement to simply walk away. The arrangement, as you call it, required my consent. I've withdrawn it. A sharp sound, a slap, followed by Felicity's gasp drove Emerson into action. He burst through the doorway to find a well-dressed man standing over Felicity, his hand raised for another blow. Step away from her, Emerson commanded, his gun leveled steadily. The man, Henry Blackwell, presumably turned with aristocratic disdain. In his early 30s, he possessed the polished good looks and bearing of wealth, currently twisted with anger. This is a private matter between my fiancé and myself, he said dismissively. I suggest you remove yourself, Cowboy. Ex-fiancé, Felicity corrected, her cheek reddening from his strike. She moved to stand beside Emerson. And this is his home you've broken into. Ah, I see. Henry's eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation. Found yourself a rustic protector, have you? How charming. Does he know you're practically penniless? That your family has disowned you. I know everything I need to know, Emerson replied evenly. Now you have two choices, ride away and never return, or discover how seriously we take trespassing in Montana territory. Henry's hand moved toward his coat and Emerson tensed, but the man merely withdrew a folded paper. I have documentation proving Felicity's unstable condition and my legal right to return her to proper care. The local authorities will support my claim. Any man who strikes a woman has surrendered any claim to her care, Emerson countered. Documentation or not. For a tense moment it seemed Henry might escalate the confrontation. Then calculation replaced rage in his expression. Very well, I'll depart for now. But this matter isn't concluded. He looked directly at Felicity. Consider carefully what you're giving up, my dear. This primitive existence can't possibly satisfy someone of your background and education. After he'd gone, Emerson lowered his weapon and turned to Felicity, gently examining her reddened cheek. Are you hurt anywhere else? She shook her head, trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. He arrived without warning, said he'd been searching for months. He won't touch you again, Emerson promised fiercely. He won't give up either, Felicity said, her voice steadier. He sees me as property, a possession to reclaim. Then we'll face him together, Emerson replied, drawing her carefully into his arms. She came willingly, her body fitting against his as naturally as if they'd embraced 1,000 times before. I don't need more time, she whispered against his shoulder. I know what I want, what I feel. Emerson pulled back slightly to meet her gaze. Are you certain? More certain than I've ever been about anything, Felicity answered. I want to stay, to build something here with you, not because I need protection or work, but because with you I've found something I never expected to find. What's that? He asked softly. Home, she said simply. You've become my home, Emerson. The kiss that followed was gentle at first, then deepened with the release of long-restrained emotion. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Emerson remembered the hidden document. There's something I need to show you, he said, retrieving the journal and survey from their hiding place. He explained his discovery as she examined the papers. This could change everything for the ranch, Felicity realized. Financial security, expansion possibilities. For us, Emerson corrected. If you'll have me, everything I build from this day forward is for us. Her smile illuminated her face despite the mark still visible on her cheek. Is that a proposal, Emerson Knight? The most sincere one you'll ever receive, he replied, taking her hand. Will you marry me, Felicity Harrington? Help me turn this land into the home it was always meant to be. Yes, she answered without hesitation. 1,000 times yes. But their newfound happiness faced an immediate threat. The following morning, Samuel Caldwell arrived with troubling news. Henry Blackwell had gone to the territorial marshal with documents suggesting Felicity had fled after misappropriating funds from her Boston employers. It's completely false, Felicity protested. He's fabricated these charges to force my return. I believe you, Samuel assured her, but the marshal has to investigate any formal complaint. How long do we have? Emerson asked. Marshal Thompson's writing from Helena, 3 days, maybe 4. After Samuel departed, Emerson and Felicity discussed their limited options. Running would only support Henry's false narrative. Fighting the allegations would be difficult without evidence or witnesses from Boston. There's one other possibility, Emerson said finally. If we were already married when the marshal arrives, your legal status would change. Henry's claims about having authority over you would be significantly weakened. A marriage of convenience, Felicity asked, uncertainty in her voice. Emerson took her hands. There would be nothing convenient about it. I want to marry you because I love you, a truth I've been too afraid to voice directly. But yes, the timing would serve a practical purpose as well. I love you too, Felicity replied, the words emerging with the certainty of long-held truth. And I'll marry you tomorrow if possible, not from fear but because it's what I truly want. The next morning they rode to River Spend, where the circuit preacher happened to be visiting. Word of the hastily arranged ceremony spread quickly through the small community, and by afternoon, the simple church was filled with curious but supportive neighbors. Felicity wore her best blue dress, adorned with wildflowers gathered by the storekeeper's daughter. Emerson, freshly shaved and wearing his soul-good shirt, waited at the altar with a mixture of nervousness and profound joy. When Felicity walked toward him, her face glowing with certainty, Emerson felt the last of his protective walls crumble completely. This woman, brave, intelligent, and stronger than anyone he'd ever known, had chosen him, chosen the life they would build together. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the small gathering erupted in genuine celebration. These frontier people understood better than most the value of finding partnership in a harsh land. Mrs. Knight, Emerson whispered as they signed the marriage certificate, the name sounding like a promise on his lips. Felicity's answering smile contained everything he'd ever wanted but had been afraid to seek: love, home, future, hope. The territorial marshal arrived 2 days later, accompanied by Henry Blackwell. They found Emerson and Felicity working together in the newly expanded garden, the picture of settled domesticity. Marshal Thompson, a weather-beaten man with shrewd eyes, listened carefully as Henry presented his accusations. When he finished, the marshal turned to Felicity. "These are serious allegations, ma'am. Do you wish to respond?" "They're entirely false," she stated calmly. "I left Boston to escape Mr. Blackwell's unwanted attention after breaking our engagement. I've stolen nothing, misappropriated nothing." "She's confused, possibly delusional," Henry interjected smoothly. "Her family has authorized me to." "Her family has no authority here," Emerson interrupted, producing their marriage certificate. "Felicity is my wife, legally married before witnesses. Whatever arrangement you claim existed before is now irrelevant." Marshal Thompson examined the document, then looked between the three of them thoughtfully. "This appears in order, Mr. Blackwell. Without substantive evidence of actual theft, receipts, witnesses, banking records, I can't justify any action against Mrs. Knight." Henry's composed facade cracked. "This is absurd. She clearly married this rancher to escape justice." "Careful," the marshal warned. "Falsifying complaints is itself a crime in this territory, one I take particularly seriously." Seeing his advantage slipping, Henry made a final desperate attempt. "I have documents proving her mental instability, signed by a Boston physician." "Convenient that the physician isn't here to verify those claims," the marshal observed dryly. "Mr. Blackwell, my advice is to return east before your position becomes even more tenuous. Mrs. Knight is clearly of sound mind, legally married, and established in this community." When Henry finally departed, his threats diminishing with each mile between them, Felicity and Emerson stood arm in arm on the porch, watching until he disappeared from sight. "Do you think he'll return?" she asked quietly. "No," Emerson replied with certainty. "Men like that prefer easier targets. Besides, we'll be too busy building something he could never understand." "And what's that?" She turned in his embrace. "A life where we both choose freely every day," he answered, brushing a gentle kiss against her forehead. "Where we're partners in everything, stronger together than we ever could be apart." Felicity smiled, the last shadows of fear fading from her eyes. "I believe that's the most romantic thing you've ever said, Mr. Knight." "I'm learning," he promised, drawing her closer. "I have an excellent teacher." As autumn painted the prairie in russet and gold, the rocking K transformed. The cabin expanded with a proper bedroom and larger kitchen. The coal deposit proved even more valuable than initially estimated, providing capital for improvements throughout the property. Emerson used the proceeds to purchase better breeding stock and additional acreage, while Felicity established a small school for neighboring ranch children 3 days a week. Their partnership flourished beyond anything either had imagined possible. Felicity's organizational skills complemented Emerson's practical knowledge of the land. His strength supported her independence rather than constraining it. Together, they created something neither could have built alone, not just a profitable ranch, but a true home filled with purpose and love. On Christmas Eve, as snow blanketed the valley in pristine white, they sat before the fire in comfortable silence. Felicity was knitting something small, a baby's blanket, though she hadn't yet shared the news she'd recently confirmed. Emerson was making notes in what had become their shared journal, recording plans for spring planting alongside personal observations. "I was thinking," he said, setting aside his pen, "about what you said when you first agreed to stay. About finding your home in a person, not a place." "I remember," she replied, her fingers continuing their rhythmic work. "I've been reflecting on why that felt so right." He moved to sit beside her on the small sofa. "My father wrote that a man needs more than land to make a life worth living. I didn't understand that until you came here. And now," she set her knitting aside, "now I understand that home isn't the ranch or even this house we've built together." He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "It's what grows between two people when they choose each other every day, when they face uncertainty together instead of alone." Felicity leaned against him, fitting perfectly into the space beside his heart that had once seemed permanently empty. "From the moment I stepped off that stage in Riversbend, I was looking for safety. What I found instead was something far more precious." "What's that?" he asked, echoing her question from months before. "The courage to stop running," she answered simply, "to build rather than escape, to love without fear." Outside, snow continued falling softly, blanketing the land that had once represented only survival to Emerson, but now held the promise of a future richer than he'd dared imagine. The rocking K was no longer merely a ranch to be worked, but the foundation of a legacy they would create together, a family's home, built on love that had flourished in the most unlikely soil. For Emerson Knight, who had once believed the frontier demanded isolation, and Felicity Harrington, who had fled east seeking only safety, their greatest discovery hadn't been in hidden documents or valuable coal seams, but in each other, in the power of two souls brave enough to choose connection over solitude, partnership over fear, love over the wounds of the past. And as the fire cast its warm glow throughout the room they'd created together, both understood with perfect clarity that they had found what humans have always sought on frontiers, both external and internal. Not just survival, but the profound joy of thriving alongside someone who sees your true self and chooses you anyway, every single day.